Let's talk about the big and chunky Space Marine walking gun turret of a dreadnought that is the Ballistus, and how strong it is in game in 10th edition. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Space Marines once more, and in this video I thought we'd do a focus unit review for the Ballistus Dreadnought, and talk about how strong the tall boy Dreadnought is with the las cannons and missile launchers. Let's talk briefly about the model, go through the datasheet including its damage and defense against a few competitors, a little bit about unit support, and take a look at how regularly it gets taken in competitive lists. The Ballistus Dreadnought is basically a development on the Redemptor chassis of Dreadnoughts that came about as a thing alongside the Primaris. The Redemptor Dreadnought is more big and powerful versus the Castaferrum Dreadnought, but exerts more of a toll on its entombed occupant, slowly draining them of life. The Ballistus is the ranged version of that, with massive firepower with twin las cannons and some high yield missiles, and it's basically used as a walking gun emplacement for the Astartes, impervious to anything but dedicated anti-tank weaponry, and well capable of ending some of the gravest enemy threats from afar. It was quite fun to see that one in action in the Leviathan trailer, taking out the Screamer Killer Carnifex. The miniature is currently £44, €55 or $70 from Games Workshop. That puts it a little bit less than the Space Marine Redemptor Dreadnought, but I feel like that's kind of to be expected given that the kit is quite a lot more simple versus the Redemptor. I think it's a nicely enough executed model, and you still get something that's basically of similar size, but it's not quite as posable and certainly has far fewer choice of weapon options. You've just got the las cannon and the missile launcher, and you don't have other things. The fact that it came out in the Leviathan box alongside all of those discounted Space Marines and Tyranids might mean that you might occasionally be able to find one going a bit cheaper second hand. But even when the box first dropped, it never seemed to be going for desperately low prices, at least not compared with things like the Tyranid Psychophages or Neurotyrants and things. It was one of the most in-demand miniatures out of that entire box set. From Games Workshop standalone box, it's not particularly impressive in points per dollar, 2 points per dollar at time of recording, which isn't great but not the absolute worst for Warhammer 40k. A lot of Space Marine kits do tend to be in around that kind of region. I feel like the miniature is a nice enough one in itself, maybe just a little bit disappointing it doesn't have some alternative war gear choices. I think it would have been really cool to have one of these with some great big autocannons. It seems Games Workshop just chose to go with the more old boxy Dreadnought style las cannon and missile launchers, to which this one is admittedly a pretty fitting update. As ever, if you were looking to pick up a Ballistus Dreadnought or any other 40k miniatures, then you can both get them cheaper than the Warhammer web store, and help support Auspex Tactics a little bit via the links in the video description. Element Games in the UK has 15% off, Gap Games in Australia has 21%, Fenris Workshop in Canada has 10% off, and Wargame Portal in the USA has 15%. All of those can save a bit of money and don't cost any additional to use if you were picking up something anyway. A big thank you to you guys using them. Let's get into the proper rules for the thing though, and the Ballistus Dreadnought costs 140 points at time of recording. It had dropped down a little bit since it first came out, as I did think it was a little bit low threat for how much it cost initially. Statline wise, it's basically the same as the Redemptor, but you don't get the -1 damage that the Redemptor has built into it. Instead you get a damage dealing special rule, and on its base profile it moves 8 inches, so a little bit slower than some of its tank competitors, and it's fairly sturdy at 12 wounds, toughness 10 with a 2+ save. The 2+ armor save is rather nice in 10th edition, given that it's pretty easy to get cover, so that means that even a lot of high AP things you'll still get a fairly good save against them. Otherwise the OC4 is handy enough, and it can potentially kick a few light infantry to death in close combat with those armoured feet. At least compared with some of the battle tanks, it will be a little bit more credible to deal some damage in melee, though obviously the focus is on range. Talking of the Redemptor Dreadnought, here's just the rough durability comparison with that. They're weighted towards a middle value of 160 points, and this one's just being done for comparison, but basically the Ballistus Dreadnought is more durable against things like a bolt rifle, where the -1 damage doesn't come into play, a bit more durable against really high damage things like las cannons, where the -1 damage thing is a bit less relevant, kind of the same versus damage 3 attacks, but the Redemptor does win the durability contest against damage 2 things, as literally halving the damage on those overcomes the points difference. Overall, I feel like it's actually a fairly close run thing in terms of durability. The Ballistus does win against everything else but damage 2, but the Redemptor's fairly significantly ahead there, and quite a few pretty dangerous units in 40k spit out a bunch of damage 2 attacks. Moving on to its big guns though, the Ballistus Dreadnought gets 4 big shots if it takes aim against tough stuff, 2 las cannon shots that get individual attacks rather than being twin linked, which is a positive, and then 2 crack missile shots at the boosted strength of 10, 2 attacks at strength 10, AP 2, and damage D6. As with lots of missile launchers, you can swap them out for a frag mode. This one gives you 2d6, strength 5, AP 0, and damage 1 attacks, and that's quite an advantage if you're fighting against hordes. Finally, it's got a couple of storm bolters to back it up, rapid fire 2 and twin links. Its damage output goes hand in hand with its special rule called Ballistus Strike. Each time this model makes a ranged attack that targets a unit that isn't below half strength, you get to re-roll the hit roll. So under normal circumstances, without any modifiers, you're hitting 8 out of every 9 shots with the Dreadnought, so really accurate there. And most of the time in 40k you will usually be hitting things that aren't below half strength, just out of random chance, though I guess you could maybe up those odds by firing it earlier in the shooting phase if you thought it was going to make a big difference. The inbuilt rerolls are quite nice, and it helps protect it against its degraded profile as well when it's got 4 or less wounds left. It also does give it a bit of anti-synergy with some Space Marine buffs though. Both at the moment usually won't help it too much, and the Tech Marine +1 to hit has a lot less limited room to help it out if you're re-rolling all those hits anyway and converting most of those attacks just at base. Here's a damage comparison that I'd featured in a previous video. Again, this one's weighted to 160 points worth of units for comparison, and this one's looking at heavier targets as opposed to lighter hordes and things, compared with a few possible rivals like the Gladiator Lancer, Repulsor Executioner, and Predator Annihilator. The Ballistus Dreadnought, I'd say, holds its own fairly well against anything that's toughness 10 or less, but against toughness 11 or 12 it loses out a bit on the raw numbers, mainly because that big crack missile will be wounding on a 5+. For these numbers, I assume that you'd be shooting against a target that was over half strength 3/4 of the time, so this one isn't getting absolutely maximal rerolls for the Ballistus. It does work out, compared with the rest of them, as the best against Terminators on this comparison at least. And if you looked at lighter infantry targets with 1 wound, it'd be the Ballistus and Repulsor Executioner doing a bit better, as they've got a fair bit more volume fire than the Lancer or Predator Annihilator. On the flip side, at least compared with these competitors, the Ballistus Dreadnought is a big win on the durability front. Pretty much the toughest for the points, both against overcharged plasma, a strength 10 missile launcher, or against las cannons. Again, it could gain a bit due to cover and armor of contempt, given that it gets a 2+ save and the rest don't. 2+ saves are nice to have with cover or with armor of contempt. Overall, putting that all together, the Ballistus Dreadnought is a long-range gun turret. Having 48-inch range on all of its weapons is quite a big deal, I think, so it can fairly safely hover in the backfield and know that it's still going to be a threat. Versus a lot of the competitors, it is quite tough for the cost with a 2+ save and 12 wounds on a fairly cheap chassis. The reroll hit roll is useful and will trigger more often than not, and it's nice to have that flexible missile launcher for a bunch of spammed anti-infantry damage if that's all you've got to shoot at. Probably the biggest downsides are the reroll hits won't stack with Oath of Moment, so not really the easiest unit to buff, and even with the rerolls the damage output still isn't absolutely spectacular, particularly against things that are toughness 11 or more. Lots of the other Space Marine big tank busting damage dealers will have far more efficient damage output than the Ballistus, maybe to be expected given its durability and range. For unit support, given those rerolls, I feel like the Ballistus is often just fairly happy doing its own thing, stomping around being fairly tough and taking big chunks out of enemy armor. At the moment won't be quite as good for it, but at least it means that you can put that elsewhere and not need to worry about buffing the Ballistus' damage. Armor of Contempt can help with a 2+ save, and Tank Shock could hand out a bit of a mortal wound punch if it needs to countercharge something. Your standard average will be 3 mortal wounds, though it could swing high or low. For the actual numbers on the Tech Marine damage buff, most things get improved by a +25% if they were going for an unaugmented 3+ to hit, and just swapping that for a 2+ to hit. Given the full hit rerolls that the Ballistus normally gets though, it'll often be +9% damage, so a bit less value there. I feel like compared with some options as well, the Ballistus Dreadnought perhaps isn't the optimal one to support with loads of extra stratagems and focal units buffs, just given it's quite cheap and you could put those things on bigger and scarier tanks and vehicles. For Space Marine support things, maybe the Stormspeeder Thunderstrike is worth a good mention though. That's the one that can give you a +1 to wound against vehicles and monsters, and it helps out the missile launcher a bit. And if you happen to have them anyway, then it could use debuffs from the Stormspeeder Hammerstrike or the Combi Lieutenant. In general though, it's likely not a unit that'd go out of my way to buff versus other scary gun tanks you might have. For detachments, the Ballistus is just going to be massively more interesting in Ironstorm Spearhead than elsewhere. Kind of good that you know that you can save the single reroll for a wound roll rather than a hit roll. And if you have managed to make it to the damage step without using the wound roll, then it could be handy enough on damage D6 weapons as well. Otherwise, it makes fairly good use of the nice enhancements on offer from the detachment. The ignore failed save thing is quite big on a 2+ save things, the lethal hits aura will be liked by the missile launcher, and the Master of Machine War could get it a bit more mobile or fall back and shoot. Mercy's weakness is always great for sustained hits on a 5+, maybe sustained lethal hits as well, though it feels like it's maybe a suboptimal target versus some other things out there. People often like that on some fairly maximal damage dealers, like say Repulsor Executioners, Gladiator Reapers, or Vindicators, depending on the exact target. I guess the Ballistas for rerolls do mean that you could reroll everything but those sustained or lethal hits without expending Oath of Moment for the whole thing, so I guess that's something. Otherwise, there's plenty of other vehicle support, things like Auto Explode, returning fire if you're below half strength, or the Walker Stratagem for +1 to hit, and the general stat line boosts. As mentioned otherwise though, I feel like often it might just be one of the things that just chips in with damage to the army, and you focus stratagems and unit buffs on other things. Plenty of the other detachments could be alright, Gladius for advancing and shooting or fall back and shooting are both helpful, the Firestorm Assault Force can keep it more mobile, and occasionally the +1 strength might be relevant I suppose. Vanguard Spearhead gets you to cover and stealth at greater than 12 inches, and I feel like that's often going to be relevant for him. Probably makes him a threat in your backfield that the opponent's just not going to find worth it to try and take out. And the Anvil Siege Force could get him Ballistic Skill 2+ if static, but again, given that you're already re-rolling, maybe not the biggest deal ever. I'd also say that there's not as much big interest from the Divergent chapters giving boosts. Maybe the Dark Angels Ravenwing Dark Shroud could be an interesting option. Cover and -1 to hit definitely keeps him more durable, though I feel like I tend to see that more with other bigger targets, maybe things like Storm Ravens or Redemptors venturing out the front, or perhaps Repulsor Executioners. Most of the rest of the chapters don't have enormously great synergy with gun turret vehicles. Templars I guess could get Feel No Pain, Deathwatch could get some scattergun damage boosts, and Ultramarines could have Rebute Gilliam and throw some free stratagems at it, or those feel maybe a bit niche and apply equally to other things. In general, Ironstorm Spearhead does seem to be the place where it's most often considered competitively, and I was interested to take a look at current army lists and how many people use it versus taking other options. As with basically every role in Codex Space Marines, the Ballistas has lots of competition for various other units to do the same thing, so I was interested to see how often it made the cut versus the competition. After looking at 11 lists that had done fairly well in grand tournaments recently, it seems that the Ballistas isn't taken all that regularly. I suspected the numbers might be kind of in this region, though maybe not quite this low. For the most part on the Dreadnought front, it seems like Redemptors are still the order of the day there more so than Mr. Ballistus. And there's a bunch of other units that are very good there, Gladiator Reapers and Lancers, Predator Destructors, Repulsor Executioners, Vindicators, and Storm Ravens, particularly for the Dark Angels versions. It seems that at current points cost, the Ballistus is alright and isn't going to necessarily be the thing that stops you doing very well with an army list, but a lot of players are choosing not to take them, tempted by some combination of these other shiny options. Overall, between the numbers, datasheets, and tournament inclusions, I'd rate it as a very usable unit, certainly not going to hold back most casual lists whatsoever, but also doesn't seem to be a tournament standout, even in the detachment that should be on paper best for it. I'd guess its main issue might be the attributes it has. It sort of wants to be at the back of the army to use its long range and get that advantage, but also its higher durability than most might mean that you want to have it kind of on the front line and taking damage before your other assets. So I feel like you might be at the point where you're risking the Ballistus Dreadnoughts just being sat at the back and kind of ignored versus the other scary things in your army, and the opponent really focusing on destroying those rather than these. Often people quite like to skew to damage dealing over defense in Warhammer 40k as well. Sometimes more important that you can just pop out of cover and then utterly ruin something, and then worry about any strike back that's coming later. In any case though, for using these in game, I'd likely want them to be used as backfield gun turrets using the good range to get lines of sight on things, ideally out of line of sight turn 1 if the opponent's got some serious long range anti-tank, and then towing behind cover even when they do pop out, to try and make sure that the opponent's shooting doesn't take too many big chunks out of them with that 2+ save. Ideally they want to be firing at things that are half strength or more, which might give you some slight different target priorities than the rest of the army, and otherwise their optimal targets tend to be things that are sort of in the range of light tanks, anything that's toughness 10 or below, though I guess you could divide fire, send the missiles one way and the last cannons another if it did make sense. After the first turn or two it might make sense to play them a little bit more aggressively than some of your other gun line things, maybe stomping up to the mid board to gain some line of sight, and they seem like a pretty reasonable option to move along the flanks of your army in an armor focused list, given that they've got some nice enough long range, better durability than some, and just a little bit more melee damage than some. Overall, definitely usable enough in a Space Marine army list, and I would certainly rate them as solid enough for good success in the vast majority of games, and they can still have some good performance on the top tables of tournaments as well, even if they're not auto includes. In any case, let me know your thoughts on the Ballistus down in the comments below. Look forward to hearing how yours have performed in 10th edition. Let me know all your ideas down in the comments. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming, and I do tend to post new ones just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to help support and keep all the content